Welcome, weary wanderers of the night, to the tragic saga of a man who defied the very foundations of Jujutsu society through sheer human will and bitter determination. Tonight, we explore the complete legend of Toji Fushiguro, the sorcerer killer whose name became synonymous with fear among those blessed with cursed energy. This is the story of a man born into a world that rejected him, who turned that rejection into a weapon sharp enough to wound even gods. So settle into comfortable darkness. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ancient grudges and modern warfare, and allow yourself to drift as we trace the blood-soaked path of the one they called the apex of human potential. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let the infinite void of sleep embrace you as we begin our journey through the blessed and cursed existence of the man who proved that even without supernatural power, the human spirit could achieve the impossible through pure, relentless will to survive. The winter of 1973 brought more than snow to the ancient halls of the Zenin estate, though few who witnessed that bitter season could have predicted how profoundly one birth would reshape the foundations of Jujutsu society itself. In a private wing reserved for the clan's most distinguished bloodlines, a child drew his first breath and immediately violated every expectation that centuries of careful breeding had established. The boy, who would become known as Toji, possessed lungs that filled with air like any other infant, eyes that opened to observe the world with ordinary human clarity, and a body that functioned according to biological principles that had governed human existence since the dawn of consciousness. What he did not possess was even the faintest trace of cursed energy. The attending physician, himself a respected member of the clan's medical council, performed the ritual examinations with growing bewilderment that slowly transformed into something approaching horror. The instruments designed to measure cursed energy potential registered nothing when applied to the newborn, not even the minimal traces that characterized ordinary humans who lived their entire lives unaware of supernatural forces. The readings were not weak or underdeveloped, but completely absent, as if the child had been born into a universe where such energy simply did not exist. The silence that followed this discovery was not the comfortable quiet of new parents absorbing the wonder of creation, but the profound stillness that accompanies recognition of fundamental wrongness, circumstances that challenged every assumption about how the world was supposed to function. The Zenin clan had spent generations cultivating bloodlines specifically designed to produce increasingly powerful cursed technique users. Their marriages arranged with mathematical precision to ensure that each generation would surpass the achievements of their predecessors through superior spiritual gifts. The child sleeping peacefully in his crib represented not merely disappointment, but existential threat to everything they had built. Proof that their careful genetic calculations could produce results that mocked, rather than validated, their understanding of inheritance and potential. His very existence suggested that power could skip generations unpredictably, that the techniques they had spent centuries refining might vanish without warning, leaving them vulnerable to enemies who had not been so careless with their spiritual patrimony. The family elders who gathered to witness what should have been a celebration instead found themselves confronting a crisis that had no precedent in their carefully maintained historical records. The boy was undeniably legitimate, born to parents whose lineages traced back through dozens of generations of documented technique users, his genetic inheritance impeccable in every respect except the one that mattered most to their understanding of worth and potential. The debates that raged through the following days were conducted with the formal courtesy that characterized all clan business, but beneath the polite language lay currents of fear and rage that threatened to tear apart relationships that had been built through decades of mutual respect and cooperation. Some argued for immediate elimination of the problem, understanding that the child's continued existence would serve as constant reminder of their fallibility and evidence that their methods were not as reliable as they had believed. Others proposed exile, banishment to distant territories where his shameful condition would not reflect poorly on the clan's reputation, while allowing him to live out whatever brief existence such a fundamentally flawed individual could manage without supernatural protection. The debate was not about the child's welfare, but about damage control, managing a public relations crisis that could undermine their political position relative to the other great families who constantly sought opportunities to exploit any sign of weakness or instability. But the decision that eventually emerged was perhaps more cruel than either execution or abandonment would have been, reflecting the particular form of malice that could only be achieved through institutional indifference, backed by absolute authority over another person's existence. The boy would remain with the clan, raised according to their traditions and educated in their methods. But he would never be considered truly one of them, never permitted to forget the fundamental inadequacy that marked him as different from those who possessed the spiritual gifts that defined their identity and purpose. The childhood that followed this decision was shaped by constant reminders of his inferiority, delivered through 1,000 small humiliations that were designed to reinforce his place in the hierarchy, while maintaining the facade of familial obligation. He was fed the same food as his cousins, but served smaller portions, clothed in garments that resembled theirs but were made from cheaper materials that emphasized his lesser status, educated in the same subjects, but held to different standards that reflected expectations appropriate to someone of his limited potential. The training sessions that occupied much of his daily routine were perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of his upbringing. Exercises specifically designed to highlight his inability to participate in the activities that gave meaning and purpose to everyone around him. While his relatives learned to manipulate cursed energy with increasing sophistication, mastering techniques that connected them to power sources beyond ordinary human comprehension, he was forced to observe from positions that emphasized his exclusion from such possibilities. The instructors who supervised these sessions treated him with the kind of distant courtesy typically reserved for servants whose competence was appreciated, but whose personal welfare remained irrelevant to larger considerations. They acknowledged his presence when protocol demanded it, but never engaged with him as if his opinions or insights might contribute meaningfully to discussions about technique development or tactical applications. He was permitted to ask questions but not encouraged to do so, allowed to practice basic forms, but never pushed to excel in ways that might suggest he possessed hidden potential, waiting to be unlocked through proper guidance. The psychological impact of this systematic exclusion was compounded by the reactions of his peers, children his own age, who had been raised to understand that cursed energy manipulation was not just a skill, but a fundamental aspect of human identity that separated them from ordinary people who lived their lives in ignorant vulnerability to forces they could neither see nor comprehend. Their treatment of him reflected not personal malice but learned behavior, responses that had been shaped by educational approaches that emphasized the vast gulf between the gifted and the powerless. The games they played naturally revolved around displays of supernatural ability, contests of technique mastery and spiritual strength that defined social hierarchies with mathematical precision, while providing entertainment that reinforced their understanding of their own superiority. His attempts to participate in these activities were met with polite tolerance that was more devastating than outright rejection would have been. Acknowledgement of his presence that emphasized rather than bridged the gap between his capabilities and theirs. But perhaps the most corrosive aspect of his treatment was not active abuse but passive indifference. The gradual recognition that he simply did not matter to people whose attention was focused on concerns that transcended his capacity to understand or contribute meaningfully toward resolution. The clan's important decisions were made without consulting him. Their strategic planning proceeded without considering how their choices might affect his welfare. Their celebrations occurred around him but not for him, as if he existed in a parallel universe that occasionally intersected with theirs but never truly merged. The physical training that he pursued with increasing desperation during his adolescent years was initially motivated by hope that superior athletic ability might compensate for his spiritual deficiencies, proof that he possessed value that could not be measured through conventional assessment methods. The exercises he designed for himself were punishing in their intensity, focused on developing strength, speed, and endurance that exceeded normal human parameters through sheer determination and systematic application of training principles that he had learned by observing the preparation methods used by more gifted clan members. The results he achieved were remarkable by any objective standard, physical capabilities that surpassed most adults, despite his youth and lack of formal instruction in combat techniques. But rather than earning recognition or respect, his achievements were dismissed as irrelevant by people who understood that no amount of ordinary human development could bridge the fundamental gap that separated him from those who possessed access to supernatural power sources. The realization that his efforts would never earn him acceptance or equality within the clan structure was accompanied by growing understanding of the broader Jujutsu world and his place within it, recognition that the attitudes he encountered daily were not unique to his family, but reflected systematic prejudices that characterized the entire sorcerer society. The discrimination he experienced was not personal vendetta, but institutional policy, approaches to the powerless that had been refined through centuries of practice and justified through philosophical frameworks that made such treatment seem natural and inevitable. The anger that gradually replaced his initial hope for acceptance was not the explosive rage of someone who had been personally wronged, but the cold fury of someone who had recognized the fundamental injustice of systems that determined human worth through accidents of birth rather than conscious choices about character and behavior. His hatred was not directed at specific individuals who had treated him poorly, but at the entire conceptual framework that made such treatment seem reasonable and appropriate to otherwise decent people. The survival instincts that developed during these formative years were not just physical but psychological, defensive mechanisms that allowed him to function in environments where his welfare was nobody's priority, while maintaining enough emotional stability to plan for futures that might offer better alternatives to his current circumstances. He learned to hide his true feelings behind masks of indifference that prevented others from using his vulnerabilities against him, to find satisfaction in small victories that others would never notice or acknowledge, to measure his progress against internal standards rather than external recognition. But most importantly, he learned that the physical capabilities he had been developing were not compensations for his lack of cursed energy, but advantages that existed precisely because he lacked such power, understanding that his heavenly restriction was not divine punishment, but cosmic balance that had traded spiritual gifts for bodily perfection in ways that the clan had been too prejudiced to recognize or appreciate. The strength that flowed through his muscles was not ordinary human potential pushed to exceptional limits, but something qualitatively different, power that existed outside normal categories, while remaining accessible through conventional training methods. His reflexes operated at speeds that exceeded conscious thought. His senses perceived details that escaped normal attention. His endurance allowed sustained effort that would exhaust even trained athletes within minutes of beginning serious exertion. The gradual recognition that he possessed capabilities that could potentially challenge even gifted sorcerers was accompanied by understanding that such capabilities would remain theoretical unless he could develop fighting techniques specifically designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that cursed energy users created through their dependence on supernatural abilities. The clan's dismissal of his potential was based on assumptions about combat that presupposed both parties would be operating within similar frameworks, using comparable power sources according to established rules that had been developed through centuries of experience with technique-based warfare. But he was not bound by such rules or limited by such assumptions, free to develop approaches that existed outside normal categories, while targeting weaknesses that conventional training never addressed because they were not relevant to battles between sorcerers with similar capabilities. His lack of cursed energy made him invisible to detection methods that relied on spiritual perception. His purely physical nature allowed him to move through defensive barriers designed to stop supernatural attacks. His unconventional fighting style could exploit gaps in defensive strategies that assumed all serious threats would follow predictable patterns. The contempt that his clan had shown for his condition was based on ignorance of what heavenly restriction actually represented. Failure to understand that the cosmic forces governing spiritual development did not create arbitrary disadvantages, but maintained balance through exchanges that traded one form of power for another. Their prejudice had blinded them to the possibility that someone they had dismissed as worthless might possess the very capabilities that could threaten everything they had built through their reliance on gifts that he could neutralize through methods they had never needed to consider. The boy who had been born into rejection was slowly recognizing that he had also been born into opportunity, circumstances that would allow him to become something unprecedented in Jujutsu history if he possessed sufficient courage and determination to embrace the potential that everyone around him was too blind to see. The Zenin clan's greatest mistake was not failing to love him, but failing to fear him while he was still young enough that their indifference might have been transformed into guidance that served their interests rather than nurturing the enemy who would eventually challenge everything they represented. But such recognition would come too late to prevent the transformation that was already beginning, the evolution of a discarded child into the weapon that would eventually earn the title that struck fear into the hearts of even the strongest sorcerers. The sorcerer killer was not born but made, forged through years of systematic rejection that had created someone whose very existence was defined by opposition to everything the Jujutsu world claimed to value and protect. The liberation that came with abandoning the Zenin compound was not the simple relief of escaping oppressive circumstances, but something approaching spiritual resurrection. The gradual awakening of potential that had been systematically suppressed through years of institutional indifference and calculated humiliation. The young man who walked away from everything that had defined his identity since birth carried with him nothing but the clothes on his back and the hard-won understanding that survival in the world beyond clan walls would require capabilities that no traditional education had prepared him to develop or deploy effectively. The first night spent sleeping in abandoned buildings and forgotten alleyways were characterized not by despair at his reduced circumstances, but by wonder at the absence of constant judgment and comparison, the freedom to move through spaces where his worth was not predetermined by spiritual gifts he had never possessed. The city that surrounded him operated according to principles he could understand and influence through effort and intelligence rather than supernatural inheritance, offering opportunities that existed outside the narrow categories that had confined his potential throughout his youth. The hunger that gnawed at his stomach during those early weeks was less painful than the spiritual starvation he had endured while surrounded by people who treated him as a failed experiment rather than a human being with inherent value. and unlimited potential for growth. The physical discomfort of inadequate shelter and irregular meals was balanced by psychological relief that came from understanding that his current circumstances were temporary conditions that could be improved through conscious choice and sustained effort rather than permanent limitations imposed by forces beyond his control. The criminal underworld that gradually became his primary social environment was populated by individuals whose relationship with conventional society bore striking similarities to his own experiences with clan hierarchy. People who had been rejected or marginalized by institutions that claimed to represent order and justice while systematically excluding anyone whose existence challenged their preferred narratives about merit and belonging. The difference was that these outcasts had chosen to embrace their outsider status rather than seeking acceptance from communities that would never welcome them as equals. The first cursed spirit he encountered during his exploration of Tokyo's hidden supernatural landscape was a weak manifestation feeding on despair in an abandoned subway tunnel, barely coherent enough to pose serious threat to ordinary humans, but sufficiently malevolent that its presence created atmospheric disturbance that made the surrounding area feel oppressive and unwelcoming. The creature's appearance was grotesque but not intimidating to someone whose childhood had been spent observing far more sophisticated expressions of supernatural malice, delivered through institutional channels that claimed moral authority. The revelation that he could see cursed spirits despite his lack of cursed energy was the first indication that his heavenly restriction might involve capabilities beyond simple physical enhancement, that the cosmic balance governing spiritual development had provided compensation for his apparent disadvantages in ways that were not immediately obvious, but could prove strategically significant if properly understood and developed through systematic experimentation and practical application. The improvised weapon he used to destroy the spirit was nothing more than a piece of rebar he had found among construction debris, but the ease with which it penetrated the creature's form suggested that ordinary materials could affect supernatural entities under certain circumstances, that the barrier between physical and spiritual realms was more permeable than traditional jujutsu education had led him to believe during his years of forced observation. The satisfaction he felt upon eliminating his first cursed spirit was not the grim pleasure of necessary task completion, but something approaching joy, recognition that he possessed the capability to affect forces that everyone had told him were beyond his reach, proof that the limitations others had imposed on his potential were based on ignorance rather than cosmic law. The destruction was swift and complete, leaving no trace of the malevolent presence that had poisoned the atmosphere of the tunnel system. The systematic hunting of weak cursed spirits that occupied his time during the following months was initially motivated by simple curiosity about the extent of his capabilities and the consistency of his results when facing supernatural threats without the protection or guidance that traditional sorcerers considered essential for such encounters. Each successful elimination provided data about his effectiveness while building confidence that had been systematically destroyed through years of institutional conditioning designed to make him accept limitations that did not actually exist. The weapons he acquired through various criminal connections were chosen not for their supernatural properties, but for their practical effectiveness in combat situations where speed and precision would determine outcomes more reliably than raw power or elaborate technique. The knives, clubs, and improvised projectiles that formed his early arsenal were unremarkable by jujutsu standards, but perfectly suited to someone whose advantages lay in physical capability rather than spiritual manipulation, tools that extended his natural abilities without requiring energy sources he could not access. The fighting style that gradually emerged from these encounters was unlike anything that traditional martial arts instruction had developed. combining elements of street combat with tactical principles derived from observation of how cursed spirits moved and attacked when facing opponents they could not immediately categorize or counter through established defensive patterns. His approach emphasized mobility over position, efficiency over spectacle, adaptation over adherence to predetermined forms that might prove inadequate when facing unknown variables. The discovery of the cursed spirit worm that would become his most valuable asset occurred during an exploration of black market, supernatural goods, creatures and artifacts that existed outside official regulatory frameworks but served essential functions for individuals whose activities required capabilities that conventional channels could not provide legally or safely. The creature's ability to exist within his body, while storing materials in spatial dimensions that existed outside normal physical constraints, was exactly the kind of advantage that could transform theoretical potential into practical superiority. The symbiotic relationship that developed between him and the worm spirit was based on mutual benefit rather than the domination and control that characterized most interactions between humans and supernatural entities. Understanding that cooperation would serve both their interests more effectively than traditional hierarchical arrangements that assumed one party must submit completely to the other's will and preferences. The creature provided storage and concealment capabilities, while he provided protection and sustenance through their shared hunting activities. The arsenal that gradually accumulated within the worm's interdimensional storage space was carefully curated to address specific tactical requirements that conventional weapons could not meet effectively. Tools and armaments designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that cursed technique users created through their dependence on spiritual energy and their assumptions about how combat should be conducted according to established principles and historical precedent. The cursed tools that formed the centerpiece of his collection were acquired through connections that existed at the intersection of legitimate business and criminal enterprise, markets that served clients whose needs could not be met through official channels, but whose resources allowed them to obtain materials that exceeded normal quality and effectiveness standards. These weapons had been crafted specifically to interact with cursed energy in ways that could disrupt or neutralize supernatural defenses, equalizing conflicts between ordinary humans and spiritually gifted opponents. The training regimen he developed during this period pushed his physical capabilities beyond every previous limit while building tactical knowledge that could not be acquired through formal instruction. Understanding of combat principles that emerged from practical experience with life and death situations where theoretical knowledge was insufficient to ensure survival against opponents whose capabilities exceeded normal human parameters in fundamental ways. The meditation practices that became central to his daily routine were not attempts to develop cursed energy, but methods for achieving mental clarity that allowed optimal utilization of his enhanced physical senses and reflexes, concentration techniques that eliminated psychological interference with instinctive responses that operated more quickly and reliably than conscious decision-making processes could manage during high-stress encounters. The first sorcerer he killed was a young man barely older than himself, someone who had been hired to eliminate a curse infestation in a warehouse district, but had become careless due to overconfidence in his inherited techniques and institutional training. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds from initial contact to final elimination, demonstrating both the effectiveness of surprise attacks and the vulnerability that spiritual sight created when opponents assumed all serious threats would be visible through conventional perception methods. The reputation that began building around these early successes was initially confined to criminal networks and underground markets, where information about unusual capabilities was valuable currency, but gradually extended into Jujutsu society itself as patterns emerged that could not be explained through normal categories of threat assessment and response planning. Someone was killing sorcerers with systematic efficiency that suggested professional competence rather than lucky accidents or temporary advantages. The psychological warfare that became integral to his approach was based on understanding that fear could be more effective than direct confrontation in many situations, that the anticipation of violence often proved more debilitating than violence itself when properly calibrated to exploit specific anxieties and uncertainties that characterized potential targets. The legend of his capabilities grew beyond their actual scope through careful cultivation of mystery and selective demonstration of results that left observers uncertain about the full extent of his threat potential. The contracts that legitimate organizations began offering him reflected recognition that his unique capabilities could serve institutional interests when properly directed and compensated, that someone who existed outside traditional hierarchies might be able to accomplish objectives that conventional sorcerers could not achieve due to political constraints or technical limitations that did not apply to individuals who operated according to different principles and priorities. The name that gradually attached itself to his growing legend was not one he had chosen, but a designation that emerged from the fear and respect his activities had generated among people who understood how difficult it was to achieve consistent success against opponents whose supernatural abilities should have provided overwhelming advantages in any direct confrontation. The Sorcerer Killer was born not through dramatic announcement, but through accumulated evidence that someone had found ways to make the impossible appear routine. The isolation that accompanied his growing reputation was different from the loneliness he had experienced within clan walls, solitude that came from strength rather than weakness, from being too dangerous rather than too insignificant to merit serious attention from people whose opinions might have mattered to him during his youth. The fear he inspired was more satisfying than the love he had once sought. Validation of his worth through proof that his capabilities demanded respect even from those who would never offer affection. The criminal enterprises that sought his services understood that his value lay not just in his ability to eliminate specific targets, but in the deterrent effect his reputation created among potential opponents. The psychological pressure that came from knowing that conventional defenses might prove inadequate against someone who operated outside normal categories of threat and response. His mere existence changed the calculations that governed how sorcerer society approached conflict resolution and resource allocation. The techniques he developed for infiltrating secure locations were based on his invisibility to cursed energy detection rather than supernatural stealth abilities, advantages that allowed him to move through defensive perimeters that had been designed to stop conventional threats while remaining undetected by monitoring systems that relied on spiritual perception rather than physical observation methods. His lack of cursed energy signature made him effectively non-existent to most security protocols. The intelligence gathering that preceded each major contract was conducted with methodical precision that reflected understanding of how crucial preparation was to successful completion of objectives that required challenging opponents, whose capabilities exceeded his own in specific areas, while remaining vulnerable to approaches that exploited their assumptions about how serious threats should behave and present themselves during confrontational situations. The satisfaction he derived from each successful elimination was not sadistic pleasure in causing suffering, but professional pride in demonstrating mastery of skills that few people could develop or deploy effectively. Validation that his approach to combat was not just theoretically sound, but practically superior to conventional methods when applied by someone with adequate preparation and commitment to excellence in execution. The transformation from rejected child to legendary assassin was complete. The evolution from victim to apex predator, achieved through systematic application of principles that had been available to him throughout his youth, but could only be accessed after he had abandoned the institutional frameworks that had prevented him from recognizing his true potential and developing the capabilities that cosmic balance had provided as compensation for apparent disadvantages. The world that had once seemed closed to him now offered unlimited opportunities for someone who understood that power came not from inherited gifts, but from the willingness to embrace whatever advantages fate had provided while refusing to accept limitations imposed by others who were too blind or prejudiced to recognize that strength could manifest in forms that transcended their narrow understanding of what was possible through human effort and determination. The sorcerer killer had been awakened, and the Jujutsu world would never be the same. The encounter that would forever alter the trajectory of Toji Fushiguro's existence occurred not in the violent underworld where he had built his reputation as the sorcerer killer, but in the most mundane of circumstances. A convenience store in a quiet residential district where ordinary people went about their daily lives without awareness of the supernatural conflicts that raged in the shadows around them. She was standing in the magazine aisle, her dark hair catching the fluorescent light in ways that made something deep within his chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion, reading the back cover of a novel with the kind of concentrated attention that suggested genuine interest rather than idle browsing. The woman who would become his salvation wore no expensive jewelry or designer clothing that might have indicated wealth or status, carried herself with quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than inherited privilege, moved through the world with the confident grace of someone who had made peace with her circumstances while maintaining hope for better possibilities. There was nothing obviously remarkable about her appearance by conventional standards, no supernatural aura or mysterious energy that would have attracted attention from those who judged worth through spiritual gifts. But something in her presence called to aspects of his personality that years of violence and isolation had nearly destroyed. Their first conversation was initiated by his clumsy attempt to reach for a drink from the refrigerator case she was standing near, an excuse for interaction that was transparent in its artificiality, but delivered with such obvious nervousness that it became endearing rather than annoying. She smiled at his fumbling words with genuine warmth that had nothing to do with fear or calculation, responding to his halting introduction with interest that seemed based on curiosity about him as a person rather than assessment of what he might be able to provide through his dangerous profession. The coffee shop where they met for their first official date was a small establishment that catered to local residents rather than tourists or business people. The kind of place where conversations could develop naturally without the pressure of impressing others or maintaining facades that required constant energy to sustain effectively. She asked him about his work with careful attention that suggested genuine interest, accepting his vague explanations about security consulting without pressing for details that he was not prepared to share, understanding instinctively that some aspects of his life required privacy for reasons that had nothing to do with lack of trust. The gradual revelation of her own circumstances came through stories shared during evening walks through neighborhoods where her daughter Tsumiki played with children whose parents worked ordinary jobs and worried about ordinary problems, like school performance and medical bills rather than cursed, spirits, and clan politics. She was raising the girl alone after the father had disappeared following promises of support that proved as empty as most commitments made by men who were not prepared for the responsibilities that came with parenthood and long-term relationships. The decision to abandon the name that had defined his identity since birth was not made through dramatic gesture or formal ceremony, but through quiet recognition that the person he was becoming in her presence bore no resemblance to the angry young man who had been shaped by years of institutional rejection and systematic dehumanization. Toji Fushiguro represented not just a new identity, but a new understanding of what was possible when someone chose to embrace connection rather than pursuing isolation as protection against further disappointment and betrayal. The small apartment they shared during their first months together was furnished with second-hand items and decorated with photographs that captured moments of genuine happiness rather than formal poses designed to project status or success, spaces that reflected their values and priorities, while acknowledging the practical limitations that came with building a life based on love rather than financial advantage or social position. The domestic routines they developed were simple but profound, daily rituals that created stability and meaning through shared commitment to each other's welfare and growth. Tsumiki's acceptance of him was gradual but wholehearted once she recognized that his presence brought peace rather than tension to her mother's life, that the man who could fight monsters was also someone who could help with homework and remember to pick up groceries without being asked multiple times. The child's trust was precious and fragile, requiring patience and consistency that challenged his instincts towards self-protection, while teaching him that vulnerability could be strength when offered to people who were worthy of such gifts. The pregnancy that followed their marriage was discovered during a routine medical appointment that had been scheduled to address what they assumed was simple fatigue from the adjustment to their new living arrangements and family responsibilities, news that filled them both with wonder and terror in equal measure as they contemplated bringing new life into circumstances that were complicated by his profession and the enemies it had inevitably created throughout his career as an assassin. The months of anticipation that preceded Megumi's birth were characterized by discussions about the kind of future they wanted to create for their children, conversations that forced Toji to articulate hopes and dreams that he had never allowed himself to consider during his years of survival-focused existence. The possibility that his son might inherit cursed techniques from distant bloodline connections created anxiety about how to provide guidance for gifts that he could not understand or demonstrate, responsibilities for which his own experiences had left him completely unprepared. The night Megumi entered, the world was marked by complications that required emergency medical intervention, hours of uncertainty, during which Toji experienced fear that made his previous encounters with deadly opponents seem trivial by comparison, understanding for the first time that there were forms of powerlessness that no amount of physical capability or tactical knowledge could address effectively. The relief that followed successful delivery was accompanied by overwhelming love that transformed his understanding of what made existence meaningful and worthwhile. The child who was placed in his arms was perfect in ways that transcended physical appearance or health status, representing possibilities that existed beyond the violent world he had known throughout his adult life. Hope that the future might contain experiences that justified the suffering and struggle that had characterized his journey from rejected clan member to legendary assassin. The tiny fingers that wrapped around his thumb seemed impossibly fragile, but carried weight that was greater than any weapon he had ever wielded. The early weeks of fatherhood challenged every assumption he had developed about his own capacity for gentleness and patience, discovering reserves of tenderness that years of violence had not eliminated, but merely buried beneath defensive mechanisms designed to protect against emotional damage that might prove tactically disadvantageous. The midnight feedings and diaper changes became opportunities for connection that were more profound than any conversation or shared activity he had experienced throughout his previous relationships. The balance between family responsibilities and professional obligations required careful management that often left him exhausted but never regretful, understanding that the love he felt for his wife and children provided motivation that was more powerful than any external reward or recognition he might receive through his work as the sorcerer killer. The contracts he accepted were chosen not just for their financial benefits, but for their compatibility with his domestic commitments, missions that could be completed without extended absences, that might damage the relationships he valued above everything else. The domestic peace they achieved during this period was unlike anything he had experienced throughout his life. Tranquility that came from belonging somewhere and being valued for qualities that had nothing to do with his ability to kill efficiently or inspire fear in potential opponents. The simple pleasure of coming home to people who were genuinely happy to see him was more satisfying than any professional triumph or successful elimination he had accomplished during his career. The revelation that Megumi had inherited the 10 Shadows technique was confirmed through incident rather than formal testing. The young child's unconscious manifestation of shadow manipulation during a nightmare, creating circumstances that required immediate response and careful concealment from neighbors who might have reported suspicious supernatural activity to authorities who would not understand the family's complicated relationship with Jujutsu society. The knowledge that his son possessed one of the most powerful and prestigious techniques in the entire catalogue of inherited abilities created complex emotions that ranged from pride in the child's potential to anxiety about the attention such gifts might attract from organizations and individuals who would view the boy as valuable asset rather than beloved family member worthy of protection and nurture. The Zenin clan's historical connection to the 10 Shadows technique meant that they would eventually learn of Megumi's existence and capabilities, creating political complications that could threaten the peaceful life they had built together. The conversations between husband and wife about how to handle their son's developing abilities were conducted with careful attention to possibilities that neither of them was fully prepared to address, understanding that conventional parenting approaches would prove inadequate for someone whose gifts placed him in categories that existed outside normal social frameworks and educational institutions. The decision to provide minimal training while concealing the extent of his potential represented compromise between immediate safety and long-term development needs. The happiness they shared during these years was not the naive bliss of people who were unaware of life's difficulties, but the mature contentment of individuals who had found something worth protecting, despite their full understanding of how precarious such circumstances could prove when external forces decided to intervene. Their love was tempered by awareness that the world contained threats that could not be defeated through determination alone, but strengthened by commitment to preserving whatever time they were granted together. The illness that claimed his wife's life arrived without warning or obvious cause, medical emergency that transformed their carefully constructed domestic tranquility into nightmare of hospital visits and treatment failures that no amount of money or determination could reverse effectively. The woman who had taught him that love was possible despite his violent profession was taken by forces that were beyond his ability to fight or intimidate, mortality that rendered all his legendary capabilities meaningless when faced with biological processes that operated according to principles he could not influence. The funeral that marked the end of their shared life was attended by neighbors and friends who had known her as devoted mother and loving wife, rather than the woman who had married the most feared assassin in Jujutsu society, people whose grief was genuine, but could not approach the devastation that threatened to destroy his capacity for continued existence. The children who stood beside him as they lowered her coffin into the ground represented both his greatest treasures and his most profound responsibilities, connections that prevented complete surrender to despair while demanding continued engagement with life. The months that followed her death were characterized by gradual recognition that the person he had become in her presence was not sustainable without the love that had made such transformation possible. Understanding that the domestic happiness they had shared was not simply interrupted, but permanently ended by circumstances that no amount of vengeance or rage could address meaningfully. The father and husband who had found peace in their small apartment was slowly being consumed by the return of the sorcerer killer's cold fury. The realization that he was becoming someone who might endanger the children he loved more than his own existence forced consideration of alternatives that violated every instinct toward protection and connection he had developed during their years together. Recognition that love sometimes demanded sacrifice, that appeared to contradict its fundamental nature, but actually represented its purest expression when properly understood. The decision to ensure their safety through separation was the most difficult choice he had ever made, abandoning everything that gave his life meaning in order to preserve their possibility for better futures. The arrangements he made for Tsumiki's care were designed to provide stability and nurture, while removing her from any potential connection to his professional activities. Placement with relatives who could offer the kind of normal childhood that his continued presence would make impossible due to the enemies and complications that followed him wherever he established residence. The girl who had accepted him as father deserved opportunities for happiness that his protection could not guarantee effectively. The negotiation with Naobito Zenin regarding Megumi's future was conducted with careful attention to creating circumstances that would maximize the child's potential while protecting him from the discrimination and abuse that had characterized his own experience with clan hierarchy and politics. The agreement they reached was not ideal, but represented the best available option for ensuring that his son would receive training appropriate to his gifts while gaining access to resources that could support his development into adulthood. The decision to walk away from everything that had made existence worthwhile was motivated not by abandonment, but by love that was willing to sacrifice personal happiness for the welfare of those who mattered more than his own comfort or satisfaction, understanding that the greatest gift he could provide was removal of the danger his presence created for people who deserved better than life spent in constant awareness of threats that emerged from his professional activities and personal enemies. The last night he spent in their apartment was characterized by memorization of details that would have to sustain him through whatever time remained of his existence, understanding that he would never again experience the peace and belonging that had defined these years of unexpected happiness. The photographs and personal items that surrounded him represented a life that was ending not through death but through conscious choice to prioritize others' welfare over his own desires and needs. The man who walked away from love and family and the possibility of continued domestic happiness carried with him both the memory of what connection could provide and the bitter knowledge that such gifts were not permanent or guaranteed, that the world contained forces powerful enough to destroy even the most carefully protected sanctuaries. The sorcerer killer had returned, but he was no longer the same person who had first earned that title through anger and resentment alone. The love that had transformed him remained even after the life that had nurtured it was gone, changing the fundamental nature of his relationship with violence and death, while providing motivation for choices that would ultimately lead him toward confrontation with the strongest sorcerer alive. The man who had once fought from hatred now carried within him the memory of what was worth protecting, even if he could no longer protect it himself through direct action and personal presence. The decision that would haunt Toji Fushiguro for the remainder of his existence began not as conscious choice, but as gradual recognition of impossible circumstances that offered no solutions consistent with conventional understanding of parental love and responsibility. The months following his wife's death had drained his financial resources through medical bills and funeral expenses that consumed the savings they had accumulated during their years of careful domestic planning, leaving him with earning potential that required extended absences and dangerous activities incompatible with providing adequate supervision for a young child whose supernatural gifts demanded constant attention and guidance. The apartment that had once represented sanctuary and hope now felt like prison, where every familiar object served as reminder of loss that could never be recovered or replaced through any application of his legendary capabilities. Spaces that echoed with memories of conversations and shared experiences that belonged to a version of himself who had believed stability was possible for someone with his history and profession. The silence that filled rooms where laughter had once been common was more oppressive than any physical constraint he had endured during his most difficult missions. Megumi's innocent questions about when his mother would return from the hospital revealed the child's inability to comprehend concepts of permanent separation and death that adults struggled to process effectively. His developing mind, still operating according to frameworks that assumed loved ones who disappeared would eventually come back if he was patient and well-behaved. The explanations that Toji attempted were inadequate for bridging the gulf between childhood assumptions about how the world functioned and realities that violated every expectation of fairness and predictability. The manifestations of the 10 Shadows technique that occurred with increasing frequency during periods of emotional stress created circumstances that required immediate response and careful concealment from neighbors who might report suspicious activities to authorities. Equipped to investigate supernatural phenomena, incidents that demonstrated both the child's extraordinary potential and his complete lack of control over abilities that could prove dangerous without proper training and guidance from qualified instructors. The realization that he possessed neither the knowledge necessary to teach cursed technique development nor the financial resources required to hire appropriate tutors was accompanied by growing awareness that his continued presence in Megumi's life represented obstacle to the child's optimal development rather than protection against external threats. Understanding that love sometimes demanded choices that appeared to contradict its fundamental nature, but actually served its deepest purposes when properly understood and implemented. The criminal organizations that had employed his services throughout his career as the sorcerer killer were becoming increasingly suspicious of his reduced availability and declining performance standards, questioning whether personal complications had compromised his professional effectiveness, while suggesting that unreliability in their business could prove fatal for everyone involved in ongoing operations. The pressure to return to full-time assassination work was accompanied by implicit threats against family members who might be used to ensure his continued cooperation and dedication. The enemies he had accumulated through years of eliminating targets whose deaths had disrupted established power structures were patient but not forgetful. Individuals and organizations whose resources allowed long-term planning and systematic revenge against someone whose activities had caused them significant financial and political damage over time. The knowledge that his location was known to people who possessed both motive and capability for retaliation created constant anxiety about security measures that were impossible to maintain while providing adequate care for a young child. The investigation into potential guardianship options revealed the limited alternatives available to someone whose personal history included associations with criminal enterprises and violent activities that would disqualify him from most conventional adoption or foster care programs. Understanding that official channels would never approve arrangements that placed a child with inherited supernatural abilities in the custody of someone whose profession involved systematic elimination of spiritual technique users. The contact with Naobito Zenin was initiated not through formal diplomatic channels, but through intermediaries who understood the delicate nature of negotiations between someone who had rejected clan authority and the institutional representatives who possessed resources that could address his son's unique educational and developmental needs while providing security that exceeded his individual capacity to guarantee effectively. The preliminary discussions were conducted with careful attention to establishing terms that would protect Megumi's interests, while acknowledging the political realities that governed relationships between the major clans and Beid, individuals who operated outside their traditional hierarchical structures. Understanding that any agreement would require compromise from all parties involved, while serving purposes that transcended personal preferences or historical grievances. The analysis of Megumi's potential that Naobito presented during their negotiations was based on careful observation and assessment techniques that revealed the true scope of the child's inherited abilities. Documentation that the Ten Shadows technique had manifested with unusual strength and clarity for someone his age, while displaying characteristics that suggested exceptional potential for future development under appropriate guidance and instruction. The financial arrangements that formed the foundation of their agreement were structured to provide immediate resources for Megumi's care and education, while establishing long-term support systems that would ensure his welfare throughout his developmental years, compensation that acknowledged both the value of his abilities and the costs associated with training someone whose gifts required specialized attention and resources that exceeded normal educational requirements. The political implications of placing someone with Megumi's capabilities within the Zenin clan's sphere of influence were complex and far-reaching, creating opportunities for the family to strengthen their position relative to other major clans, while assuming responsibilities for nurturing potential that could eventually surpass their current leadership capabilities if properly developed and guided according to principles that prioritized excellence over tradition. The psychological framework that Toji constructed to rationalize his decision emphasized the opportunities that clan membership would provide, rather than the abandonment that such arrangements necessarily entailed. Understanding that his son would receive training and resources that were impossible to obtain through alternative channels, while gaining access to social networks that could support his advancement throughout his adult career. The legal documentation that formalized their agreement was crafted with careful attention to protecting all parties' interests, while establishing clear boundaries regarding decision-making authority and ongoing communication between the child and his biological father, arrangements that acknowledged Toji's continued emotional investment, while recognizing that practical custody would transfer to individuals better equipped to handle the educational and social requirements associated with raising someone with supernatural abilities. The rationalization that allowed him to proceed with arrangements that violated every instinct toward protection and nurture was based on understanding that love sometimes required sacrifice of personal satisfaction for the welfare of those who mattered more than individual happiness or comfort. Recognition that his presence in Megumi's life had become liability rather than asset due to circumstances beyond his control or ability to modify through conventional means. The final conversation with his son was conducted without revealing the permanent nature of their separation. Understanding that the child's psychological welfare required gradual adjustment rather than traumatic revelation that could damage his capacity for future relationships and emotional development. Words that were chosen to provide comfort and reassurance while avoiding promises that could not be kept honestly. The moment of physical separation was accomplished with clinical efficiency that masked the emotional devastation that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for continued functioning. Understanding that any display of weakness or uncertainty might undermine the child's adjustment to circumstances that were already challenging enough without additional complications created by paternal distress or obvious regret about necessary decisions. The money that changed hands during the finalization of their agreement represented not payment for services rendered, but compensation for losses that could never be adequately addressed through financial means. Understanding that the transaction involved elements that transcended normal commercial relationships while serving practical purposes that justified the emotional costs associated with its implementation. The detachment that he cultivated during the weeks following his son's transfer to clan custody was not natural response to loss, but conscious choice to protect himself from grief that might prove incapacitating while maintaining enough emotional stability to function effectively in professional situations that required clear thinking and decisive action under extreme pressure. The reports he received regarding Megumi's adjustment and progress were filtered through official channels designed to provide reassurance without creating opportunities for interference in educational processes that were proceeding according to carefully developed plans. Information that confirmed his decision had been correct, while offering no relief from the guilt that accompanied successful implementation of choices that served everyone's interests except his own emotional needs. The transformation of his relationship with his son from direct involvement to distant observation was perhaps the most painful aspect of arrangements that had been designed to minimize suffering while maximizing opportunities for optimal development. Understanding that love could be expressed through absence as effectively as through presence, when circumstances demanded such sacrifice from parents who possessed sufficient wisdom to prioritize their children's welfare over their own desires. The philosophical framework that sustained him through the months following this separation was based on understanding that fatherhood involved responsibilities that sometimes required choices that appeared to contradict its fundamental nature but actually represented its purest expression when properly understood and implemented according to principles that prioritized long-term welfare over immediate satisfaction and emotional comfort. The knowledge that Megumi would grow up with advantages that his own childhood had never provided offered some consolation for decisions that had cost him everything that made existence meaningful and worthwhile. Understanding that the cycle of discrimination and abuse that had defined his early experiences would not be repeated in the next generation if current arrangements proceeded according to plan. The visits he made to observe his son from distance were conducted with careful attention to avoiding detection while gathering information about the child's development and happiness, understanding that any direct contact might undermine the stability that had been achieved through careful arrangement while creating confusion about relationships and expectations that had been established through formal agreements. The pride he felt when witnessing evidence of Megumi's growing competence and confidence was complicated by awareness that such achievements were occurring without his guidance or participation, success that validated his decision, while emphasizing the completeness of his exclusion from the life he had helped create through his sacrifice and careful planning. The guilt that accompanied this pride was based on understanding that his absence was both necessary and chosen, that alternative approaches might have preserved their relationship while compromising his son's potential for optimal development, decisions that served the child's interests while destroying the father's capacity for conventional happiness and satisfaction. The hope that sustained him through the darkest periods following this separation was grounded in faith that Megumi would eventually understand the motivations behind choices that must have seemed like abandonment from a child's perspective, recognition that mature understanding might eventually transform resentment into appreciation for sacrifices that had been made on his behalf. The man who walked away from fatherhood carried with him both the memory of love that had transformed his understanding of what made existence worthwhile, and the bitter knowledge that such love sometimes demanded choices that appeared to contradict its essential nature while actually serving its deepest purposes through sacrifice, that preserved what was most precious at the cost of personal happiness and fulfillment. The sorcerer killer who emerged from this experience was fundamentally different from the angry young man who had first earned that title through rejection and resentment. Someone whose relationship with violence had been complicated by understanding of what was worth protecting, even when such protection required methods that violated every instinct toward nurture and connection that defined healthy human relationships and family bonds. The commission that would transform Toji Fushiguro from legendary assassin into instrument of cosmic change arrived through channels so discreet that even he, with his extensive network of criminal contacts and underground information brokers, required several weeks to verify the authenticity and resources of the organization making the offer. The Time Vessel Association presented themselves as concerned citizens whose philosophical objections to Master Tengen's continued existence were based on principles rather than personal animosity, individuals who believed that immortality represented violation of natural law that threatened the spiritual balance governing human civilization. The initial meeting was conducted in a warehouse district where abandoned industrial buildings provided privacy. While their mundane appearance discouraged casual observation by law enforcement or Jujutsu society, surveillance networks, spaces that had been chosen specifically for their lack of cursed energy residue or supernatural significance that might attract attention from individuals whose perception extended beyond normal human senses and capabilities. The representative who presented their proposal was middle-aged businessman whose unremarkable appearance and conventional mannerisms concealed sophisticated understanding of Jujutsu society's hierarchical structures and operational procedures, knowledge that had been accumulated through years of careful observation and intelligence, gathering conducted by people whose lack of cursed energy made them effectively invisible to detection methods that relied on spiritual perception rather than conventional investigative techniques. The target they described was unlike any assignment Toji had previously accepted. Not individual sorcerer whose elimination would serve criminal interests or personal vendettas, but cosmic entity whose continued existence maintained barrier systems that protected Japanese civilization from supernatural threats that would otherwise overwhelm human society's capacity for defense and survival. The complexity of the mission extended beyond simple assassination towards strategic disruption of institutional processes that had operated unchanged for centuries. The star plasma vessel, who would serve as key to Tengen's evolutionary cycle, was a 14-year-old girl whose innocent appearance concealed spiritual significance that made her simultaneously the most important and most vulnerable person in contemporary Jujutsu society, someone whose willing sacrifice would preserve existing power structures, while her death would create opportunities for fundamental change that could benefit those who operated outside traditional hierarchies. The two students assigned to protect Riko Amanai during her final days represented pinnacle of contemporary Jujutsu education, young sorcerers whose exceptional abilities and institutional training had prepared them for challenges that would overwhelm most adult practitioners, while leaving them vulnerable to approaches that existed outside their experience and theoretical understanding of combat possibilities and tactical variations. Satoru Gojo's reputation as inheritor of both Six Eyes and limitless techniques made him most dangerous individual of his generation, someone whose spatial manipulation capabilities and supernatural perception created advantages that conventional assassination methods could not overcome through direct assault or traditional ambush tactics. requiring innovative approaches that exploited weaknesses created by his very strengths and overconfidence in his own invincibility. Suguru Geto's curse manipulation technique represented different category of threat. Abilities that provided versatility and adaptability that could counter unexpected tactics, while his philosophical sophistication and tactical intelligence made him a dangerous opponent even when separated from his supernatural resources. Someone whose elimination would require methods that prevented him from utilizing his extensive repertoire of absorbed spirits. The strategic framework that Toji developed for accomplishing objectives that exceeded normal assassination parameters was based on understanding that direct confrontation with targets of such exceptional capability would likely result in his own destruction, regardless of preparation or tactical advantages, requiring approaches that emphasized psychological warfare and systematic degradation of their resources before attempting final elimination. The first component of his strategy involved creating a bounty system that would attract every minor, criminal, and desperate curse user in Tokyo to attempt elimination of the star plasma vessel, understanding that while none of these individuals possessed capability to succeed against her protectors, their constant harassment would exhaust the student's resources while providing cover for his own movements and preparations. The coordination required to implement such widespread assault was simplified by his reputation within criminal networks and his understanding of how desperation could motivate people to attempt objectives that rational analysis would reveal as hopeless, leveraging existing resentments against Jujutsu society, while providing financial incentives that made participation seem worthwhile, despite obvious risks and minimal probability of success. The psychological impact of defending against constant low-level threats would gradually erode the students' alertness and decision-making capabilities, while forcing them to reveal their tactical preferences and technical limitations through repeated deployment of techniques under combat conditions. Intelligence that would inform his eventual direct assault when their defenses had been sufficiently compromised through systematic attrition. The second phase of his strategy involved patience that exceeded normal professional requirements, understanding that timing would determine success or failure more reliably than superior technique or overwhelming force, waiting for circumstances that would provide optimal conditions for engagement while his targets were psychologically and physically exhausted from extended defensive operations. The vacation that Gojo and Geto took to Okinawa represented exactly the kind of tactical error that his strategy had been designed to encourage. Overconfidence bred by successful completion of numerous minor encounters, leading them to believe that the primary threat had been eliminated or discouraged by their demonstrated competence. Relaxation of vigilance that would make them vulnerable to approaches they had not previously considered or prepared for adequately. The weapons preparation that occupied Toji during this waiting period was conducted with meticulous attention to ensuring that every tool in his arsenal was optimized for the specific challenges that his target's abilities would create, understanding that conventional armaments would prove inadequate against opponents whose supernatural defenses required specialized counters and tactical innovations. The inverted spear of heaven that formed the centerpiece of his planned assault possessed properties specifically designed to neutralize cursed technique defenses. Legendary weapon whose anti-cursed energy characteristics could potentially penetrate even Gojo's spatial manipulation barriers if deployed with sufficient skill and precision at moment when the target's concentration was compromised through surprise or misdirection. The chain of 1,000 miles provided mobility and tactical flexibility that would allow him to control engagement range while maintaining options for rapid repositioning if circumstances required adaptation to unexpected developments. Understanding that prolonged engagement would favor opponents whose stamina was enhanced by cursed energy reinforcement, while his purely physical capabilities operated within more limited parameters. The cursed spirit worm that served as his mobile armory had been trained to respond to subtle signals that would allow rapid weapon deployment without telegraphing his intentions through obvious preparation movements. Tactical advantage that could provide decisive edge during critical moments when split-second timing determined success or failure of carefully planned attacks. The surveillance network that he established throughout Tokyo during the weeks preceding their return was designed to provide early warning of his target's movements while identifying opportunities for engagement that would maximize his advantages while minimizing their ability to coordinate defensive responses or call for reinforcement from institutional support systems. The psychological profile he had developed of both students was based on careful analysis of their previous mission reports and behavioral patterns, understanding that Gojo's arrogance and natural confidence could be exploited through approaches that challenged his assumptions about his own invincibility, while Geto's protective instincts toward his partner could be used to create tactical disadvantages through emotional manipulation. The moment of their return from Okinawa was monitored through multiple information sources that provided real-time intelligence about their schedule and route selection, data that allowed him to position himself optimally for initial contact, while ensuring that escape routes remained available if tactical developments required strategic withdrawal rather than continued engagement. The underground passages beneath Tokyo provided ideal terrain for someone whose advantages lay in close quarters combat and environmental awareness rather than supernatural technique deployment. Confined spaces that would limit his target's mobility, while providing numerous opportunities for ambush and misdirection that could neutralize their superior firepower through tactical positioning. The ambush itself was executed with clinical precision that reflected months of preparation and strategic thinking. Initial strike designed to inflict maximum physical and psychological damage, while establishing control over engagement parameters that would determine how subsequent combat developed. Understanding that first moments of contact would likely determine ultimate outcome of entire encounter. The blade that penetrated Gojo's torso was positioned to cause serious injury without immediate lethality. Tactical choice designed to compromise his combat effectiveness while creating psychological pressure through awareness of his own vulnerability. Demonstration that even the strongest sorcerer could be hurt when facing opponents who understood how to exploit the weaknesses created by overconfidence and predictable behavioral patterns. The speed and efficiency with which he transitioned from initial surprise attack to systematic assault on both targets demonstrated integration of physical capability with tactical knowledge that had been refined through years of professional experience. Understanding that hesitation or incomplete commitment would allow them to recover and coordinate responses that could quickly shift advantage in their favor. The cursed spirits that Geto deployed as defensive measures were eliminated with casual efficiency that emphasized the gap between theoretical training and practical combat experience. Techniques that had been developed through institutional instruction, proving inadequate against someone whose understanding of supernatural entities was based on systematic hunting rather than academic study of their properties and behavioral patterns. The injuries that accumulated on both students during this initial encounter were carefully calibrated to degrade their capabilities without providing them with desperation that might lead to unpredictable responses. Systematic weakening that would make subsequent phases of his strategy more likely to succeed while maintaining his psychological advantage through demonstrated superiority. The elimination of Riko Amanai was accomplished with mechanical precision that reflected his understanding that sentimentality had no place in professional operations. Regardless of personal feelings about killing someone whose only crime had been possessing spiritual significance that made her existence incompatible with his employer's objectives. Duty that required suppression of emotional responses that might interfere with tactical requirements. The headshot that ended her life was delivered at a moment when the psychological impact would be maximized for his primary targets. Demonstration of his willingness and capability to eliminate anyone regardless of their protected status or the efforts being made to defend them. Message that traditional concepts of sanctuary and safety were meaningless when facing someone who operated outside normal moral and tactical constraints. The subsequent defeat of Geto was achieved through systematic exploitation of the emotional trauma caused by witnessing Riko's death, combined with his physical injuries and exhaustion from extended combat. Understanding that psychological warfare could be more effective than direct assault when properly timed and implemented against opponents whose strength was based partly on confidence and mental stability. The decision to leave Geto alive rather than completing his elimination was based on tactical calculation rather than mercy. Understanding that someone who relied on Shikigami techniques rather than the clan-based inherited abilities that he despised represented less a threat to his philosophical objectives, while his survival might serve strategic purposes in future conflicts. The moment of triumph when he stood over his defeated opponents represented validation of everything he had believed about the relationship between inherited privilege and actual capability. Proof that superior preparation and tactical intelligence could overcome advantages that Jujutsu society considered insurmountable when wielded by individuals who had been properly trained and educated according to traditional methods. The satisfaction he felt was not sadistic pleasure in causing suffering, but professional pride in demonstrating mastery of skills that few people could develop or deploy effectively. Confirmation that his approach to combat was not just theoretically sound, but practically superior to conventional methods when applied by someone with adequate preparation and commitment to excellence in execution and strategic planning. The mission that had begun as simple assassination contract had evolved into something approaching philosophical statement about the nature of power and the assumptions that governed how Jujutsu society understood strength and weakness. Demonstration that human potential could exceed supernatural gifts when properly channeled and applied, according to principles that existed outside traditional categories of threat assessment. The man who walked away from this encounter had proven everything he had set out to demonstrate about the relationship between inherited advantages and earned capability, but the victory was incomplete in ways that would soon become apparent when circumstances forced him to confront the consequences of creating rather than destroying the strongest sorcerer who had ever existed. The blade that had pierced through flesh and bone, and the fundamental assumptions about invincibility that had shaped Satoru Gojo's entire understanding of his place in the world, should have been the final punctuation mark on a life that had burned brighter and briefer than any star in the most constellation of Jujutsu history. The inverted spear of heaven had done its work with mechanical precision, anti-cursed energy properties, neutralizing the spatial barriers that had made him effectively untouchable throughout his brief but extraordinary career, leaving him bleeding in underground tunnels that would serve as monument to the hubris of believing that inherited gifts were sufficient protection against someone who understood how to turn advantages into weaknesses. The pool of blood that spread beneath his motionless form was ordinary human crimson despite the supernatural circumstances of its spilling, proof that beneath all the legendary techniques and inherited power, lay mortality as fragile as any other person's, flesh that could be cut, and life that could be ended by someone with adequate skill and sufficient determination to challenge what others considered unchangeable natural law. The silence that followed his collapse was complete and profound, absence of breath and heartbeat that should have marked the conclusion of his brief participation in cosmic conflicts that extended far beyond individual ambition or personal vendetta. But the mind that had been shaped by the six eyes retained consciousness even as the body that housed it failed to maintain the basic biological functions necessary for continued existence. Awareness that persisted in the liminal space between life and death, where theoretical understanding could transform into practical application if sufficient desperation and ingenuity could overcome the technical limitations that had previously made certain achievements impossible for even the most gifted practitioners. The reverse curse technique that he had studied but never successfully implemented was not just theoretical concept, but survival mechanism that could theoretically restore damaged tissue through application of principles that inverted the normal relationship between cursed energy and physical matter. Understanding that healing was not magical restoration but scientific process that could be accomplished through precise manipulation of energy flows and biological systems according to mathematical relationships that his supernatural perception could calculate with perfect accuracy. The moment of realization that death was not inevitable but merely another problem requiring solution through superior technique and unwavering determination was accompanied by a surge of cursed energy that exceeded anything he had previously achieved, power that was not drawn from external sources but generated through perfect synthesis of will and understanding, desperation that refined his connection to fundamental forces in ways that conventional training had never accomplished. The healing that began in his core and spread outward through damaged organs and severed arteries was not gradual recovery, but explosive regeneration that restored not just physical function, but enhanced every system beyond its original parameters. Transformation that pushed his capabilities past every previous limit while burning away the psychological constraints that had prevented complete integration of his inherited techniques with his developing understanding of their ultimate potential. The resurrection that occurred in those underground tunnels was not return to his previous state, but evolution into something unprecedented. Someone who had experienced mortality while retaining the power to transcend it, understanding that had been paid for with direct confrontation with the fundamental vulnerability that defined human existence regardless of spiritual gifts or inherited advantages. The awakening that followed was marked by sensory perception that exceeded even his previous six eyes capabilities, awareness that penetrated through layers of reality that normal consciousness could not access, while providing computational power that transformed complex theoretical relationships into instinctive understanding of how space and time, matter interacted according to principles that could be influenced through conscious manipulation. The rage that accompanied this rebirth was not emotional response to physical injury, but intellectual fury at having been outmaneuvered by someone whose advantages should have been insufficient to bridge the gap between human capability and supernatural power, anger that was refined by new understanding into determination to demonstrate that his defeat had been temporary setback rather than fundamental limitation of his abilities or potential. The search for Toji that began immediately upon his recovery was conducted with systematic precision that reflected his enhanced understanding of how to apply his techniques for purposes beyond simple combat application, spatial manipulation that allowed him to move through Tokyo with speed that approached teleportation while his enhanced perception scanned for traces of cursed energy disruption that would indicate the presence of someone whose very existence created distortions in supernatural fields. The trail that led him back to his opponent was not obvious, but discernible to someone whose senses had been refined beyond normal limitations. Understanding that Toji's lack of cursed energy created patterns of absence that were as distinctive as positive signatures when viewed through perception that could analyze the mathematical relationships governing how spiritual forces flowed through urban environments and architectural structures. The confrontation that followed was fundamentally different from their previous encounter. Not ambush executed against unsuspecting targets, but direct challenge between opponents who understood each other's capabilities while possessing complete commitment to proving their superiority through methods that would leave no ambiguity about the outcome or its implications for their respective approaches to power and its application. The Toji, who faced him in their second battle, was unchanged in his physical capabilities, but forced to acknowledge that the psychological advantages he had gained through his initial victory had been eliminated by circumstances that exceeded his previous experience with how supernatural recovery could function when deployed by someone with adequate understanding and sufficient desperation to push techniques beyond established parameters. The speed that characterized their renewed combat exceeded anything that had occurred during their first encounter. Movements that blurred beyond normal perception, while techniques were deployed with precision that reflected perfect integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application. Understanding that hesitation or incomplete commitment would prove fatal when facing opponents who possessed both exceptional capability and absolute determination to achieve victory regardless of cost. The red technique that Gojo deployed with casual mastery demonstrated how thoroughly his brush with death had refined his understanding of spatial manipulation, repulsive force that was calibrated with mathematical precision to inflict maximum damage while providing tactical control over engagement parameters. Power that was not simply raw energy, but elegant application of fundamental principles. According to calculations that his enhanced perception could process instantaneously, the impact that sent Toji careening across the battlefield was accompanied by structural damage that demonstrated the increased scope of his abilities. Cursed energy that was not just more powerful but more precisely controlled than anything he had previously achieved. Techniques that operated with efficiency, that eliminated wasted motion while maximizing destructive potential through perfect understanding of how force could be applied most effectively. The building that absorbed Toji's collision was transformed from architectural structure into abstract art, created through application of overwhelming supernatural power. Concrete and steel reshaped according to principles that transcended normal engineering while serving as canvas for techniques that existed at intersection of physics and philosophy, mathematical relationships made manifest through conscious will. But the recovery that followed demonstrated why Toji had earned his reputation as someone who could not be eliminated through conventional methods. Heavenly restriction, providing physical resilience that allowed him to survive impacts that would have destroyed lesser opponents, while his tactical intelligence remained uncompromised by damage that would have incapacitated normal humans permanently. The counterattack that he launched was executed with desperate precision that reflected his understanding that their renewed engagement would likely be his final opportunity to prove that human determination could overcome supernatural advantages when properly applied through methods that existed outside traditional categories of combat and technique deployment. The chain that he deployed to control engagement range was wielded with skill that transformed simple tool into extension of his tactical awareness, movements that demonstrated integration of weapon mastery with environmental understanding while creating opportunities for assault patterns that could potentially exploit weaknesses in his opponent's enhanced but not perfected defensive capabilities. The blue technique that Gojo used to counter these attacks was deployed with casual confidence that emphasized the vast improvement in his abilities, attractive force that was not simply more powerful than his previous applications, but fundamentally different in its precision and tactical sophistication, understanding that had been refined through direct confrontation with mortality into practical mastery. The mathematical relationships that governed their exchange of attacks were visible to Gojo's enhanced perception as geometric patterns that could be manipulated through conscious adjustment of variables that determined how space, time and matter interacted according to principles that approach divine understanding, capabilities that had been present throughout his development, but never fully accessed until desperation had forced transcendence of self-imposed limitations. The realization that his opponent had evolved beyond his capacity to defeat through conventional methods was accompanied by Toji's acknowledgement that pride and philosophical principle could not overcome fundamental disadvantages when facing someone who possessed both superior power and the wisdom to deploy it effectively. Understanding that his initial victory had been achieved through circumstances that could not be replicated against opponent who now understood the true scope of his own potential. The hollow purple technique that emerged from combination of his red and blue applications was not just advancement in his technical repertoire, but expression of understanding that had been earned through direct confrontation with death, power that existed at intersection of attraction and repulsion, while transcending both through synthesis that created effects beyond normal categories of cursed energy manipulation. The space that was eliminated rather than simply damaged by this technique demonstrated capabilities that approached reality manipulation, matter and energy that simply ceased to exist rather than being transformed or displaced according to normal physical principles. Destruction that was so complete that it left void where Toji had been standing rather than debris or residue that might have suggested conventional explosive force. The silence that followed was different from the quiet that had marked Gojo's apparent death. Not absence of sound, but presence of emptiness that had been carved from reality itself. Demonstration that his evolution had produced capabilities that exceeded every previous understanding of what was possible through cursed technique development and application. The satisfaction that accompanied this absolute victory was complicated by recognition that his opponent had served as catalyst for transformation that might not have occurred under different circumstances, understanding that Toji's challenge had forced growth that conventional training could never have achieved, while proving that human potential could indeed transcend apparent limitations when properly motivated and directed. The man who walked away from this encounter had proven not just that he could overcome defeat, but that failure could serve as foundation for achievement that exceeded every previous accomplishment. Evolution that had been paid for with blood and trauma, but had produced capabilities that placed him beyond challenge from anyone who relied on conventional understanding of power and its limitations. The legend that would grow from this demonstration of resurrection and transcendence would establish patterns that defined how future generations understood the relationship between crisis and growth. Proof that the strongest could become stronger. Still, when circumstances demanded evolution beyond every previous limit, while maintaining the essential humanity that gave such power, meaning, and purpose. The strongest sorcerer had been born not through inheritance or training, but through direct confrontation with mortality and the determination to transcend it through methods that existed at the boundary between technique and miracle, understanding that true power came not from avoiding failure, but from transforming it into foundation for achievements that exceeded every previous possibility. The resurrection that had transformed Satoru Gojo from prodigiously talented student into something approaching a force of nature was not merely personal triumph over mortality, but cosmic event that reverberated through every layer of Jujutsu society, with implications that would reshape the fundamental balance of power for generations to come. The techniques that had saved his life in those underground tunnels represented breakthrough in understanding that transcended individual achievement while establishing new parameters for what was possible when theoretical knowledge met absolute desperation backed by supernatural capability. The enhanced perception that accompanied his recovery operated on levels that exceeded even his previous six eyes abilities. Awareness that penetrated through dimensions of reality that normal consciousness could not access, while providing computational power that transformed the most complex mathematical relationships into instinctive understanding of how fundamental forces could be manipulated through conscious will, applied according to principles that existed at the intersection of science and something approaching divine authority. The reverse curse technique that had restored his damaged body was not simply healing but evolutionary process that had optimized every biological system while burning away psychological limitations that had prevented complete integration of his inherited gifts with his developing understanding of their ultimate potential, transformation that had been paid for with direct confrontation with mortality, but had produced capabilities that placed him beyond the reach of conventional threat assessment or tactical planning. The spatial manipulation abilities that he now possessed operated with precision that approached mathematical perfection, techniques that were not simply more powerful than his previous applications, but fundamentally different in their relationship to the fabric of reality itself, understanding that space and time were not fixed constraints, but variables that could be adjusted through conscious application of principles that his enhanced awareness could perceive and influence with casual efficiency. The hollow purple technique that had eliminated Toji represented synthesis of opposing forces that created effects beyond normal categories of cursed energy manipulation, power that existed at the intersection of attraction and repulsion, while transcending both through integration that produced destruction so complete that matter simply ceased to exist rather than being transformed or displaced according to conventional physical principles. But the most profound aspect of his transformation was not the enhancement of his technical capabilities, but the psychological evolution that accompanied his brush with death, understanding that true strength required not just superior power, but wisdom about how such power should be deployed in service of purposes that transcended personal ambition or individual satisfaction, recognition that his abilities carried responsibilities that extended far beyond his own welfare or immediate objectives. The isolation that had characterized his childhood and adolescence was now complete in ways that exceeded even his previous experience with separation from normal human relationships. Understanding that the gap between his capabilities and those of everyone around him had widened beyond any possibility of genuine peer interaction or mutual understanding based on shared limitations and common vulnerabilities that defined ordinary human experience. The loneliness that accompanied this evolution was different from the rejection he had experienced within his family structure. Solitude that came from transcendence rather than inadequacy, from being too powerful rather than too weak to fit within existing social categories and relationship frameworks that assumed comparable levels of capability and mutual dependence for survival and success. The philosophical questions that began emerging during his recovery period were focused not on how to use his enhanced abilities, but on whether someone who possessed power that approached omnipotence within his sphere of influence could maintain meaningful connections with people whose welfare depended entirely on his restraint and protection, relationships that were fundamentally asymmetrical in ways that made genuine equality or reciprocity impossible to achieve or maintain. The teaching career that would eventually define his adult identity was still years in the future, but the seeds of that vocation were planted during his contemplation of what responsibilities came with capabilities that exceeded every historical precedent, while remaining grounded in essentially human consciousness and moral framework. Understanding that strength without purpose was merely potential for destruction, waiting for excuse or opportunity to manifest. The legend that began building around his resurrection and demonstration of unprecedented technique mastery was initially confined to Jujutsu society, but gradually extended into broader supernatural communities whose members understood that fundamental shifts in power, balance, required adjustment of strategic thinking and tactical approaches that had been developed according to assumptions that his existence had permanently invalidated. The fear that his name began inspiring among potential opponents was not simple recognition of superior combat capability, but understanding that conventional approaches to conflict resolution were meaningless when facing someone whose techniques operated outside established categories of threat and response, whose power was not just overwhelming, but qualitatively different from anything that traditional defensive strategies had been designed to counter or mitigate. The political implications of his evolution were complex and far-reaching, creating opportunities for institutional change that had been impossible when power structures were maintained through careful balance between competing factions, whose capabilities were roughly comparable. Understanding that someone who could single-handedly eliminate any opposing force would necessarily become focal point for every major decision affecting Jujutsu Society's future direction and priorities. The expectations that others began placing on his shoulders were both unrealistic and inevitable. Understanding that people who had lived their entire lives within systems that assumed protection came through institutional cooperation would naturally look to someone with his capabilities to solve problems that had previously required collective effort and political compromise, responsibilities that no individual should be forced to bear regardless of their power or competence. The burden of being constantly viewed as solution to every crisis and ultimate authority on every dispute was perhaps more psychologically damaging than the physical trauma he had endured during his confrontation with Toji. Weight of expectation that threatened to transform him from person into symbol, from individual with his own needs and limitations into resource that existed primarily to serve others' requirements and preferences. The distance that began developing between him and even his closest friends was not result of conscious choice but inevitable consequence of evolution that had placed him in category where normal relationship dynamics could not function effectively. Understanding that genuine companionship required some degree of mutual vulnerability and interdependence that his capabilities had eliminated permanently. The conversations with Suguru Geto that had once provided intellectual stimulation and emotional connection became increasingly strained as the gap between their respective abilities widened beyond point where meaningful competition, collaborative problem-solving was possible. Friendship that was slowly being undermined by fundamental changes in the nature of their individual relationships with power and responsibility. The missions that he undertook during the months following his resurrection were completed with efficiency that bordered on casual indifference, threats that would have challenged entire teams of professional sorcerers eliminated through application of techniques that required minimal effort or conscious attention. Understanding that his enhanced capabilities had made conventional jujutsu work feel more like maintenance tasks than meaningful challenges. The satisfaction that had once come from successful mission completion was replaced by a growing sense of disconnection from the very activities that were supposed to give his existence purpose and meaning. Understanding that victory achieved without struggle or uncertainty provided no validation of competence or character, no evidence that effort and dedication had produced results worthy of pride or accomplishment. The psychological framework that he began developing to cope with these changes was based on understanding that his relationship with strength had fundamentally altered. That power of his magnitude created obligations that transcended personal preference while eliminating most sources of conventional human satisfaction and connection, responsibilities that required sacrifice of individual happiness for collective welfare. The realization that he was becoming something other than human, despite his determination to preserve his essential humanity, was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his evolution. Understanding that capabilities of his scope necessarily created separation from ordinary experience, that made certain forms of connection and understanding impossible to maintain regardless of conscious intention or emotional commitment. The teaching methods that he would eventually develop were beginning to form during this period of adjustment and self-examination. Recognition that his greatest contribution to Jujutsu society might not be direct application of his overwhelming power, but nurturing of others who could achieve excellence within their own limitations while maintaining the human connections that his evolution had made impossible for him to sustain. The students who would someday benefit from his instruction were still children during this period, but his growing understanding of isolation and responsibility was already shaping approaches to education that emphasized emotional development alongside technical training, methods that would help future generations avoid the psychological traps that had transformed his greatest triumph into source of permanent separation from everything that made existence meaningful. The enemy that he had created through his victory over Toji was not external threat, but internal struggle with purposelessness that accompanied power so vast that no challenge could provide meaningful test of his capabilities or character. Understanding that true strength sometimes required conscious acceptance of limitation and vulnerability rather than pursuit of ever greater transcendence. The wisdom that gradually emerged from his contemplation of these paradoxes was based on recognition that the strongest person was not necessarily the one with the greatest power, but the one who could use whatever power they possessed in service of something greater than personal achievement or recognition. Understanding that meaning came not from capability but from conscious choice about how capability would be deployed. The foundation for his eventual role as educator and protector was being established through direct experience with the costs that accompanied ultimate achievement. Understanding that his greatest gift to future generations would not be demonstration of perfect technique, but example of how someone with unlimited power could choose to remain essentially human, despite every incentive and opportunity to transcend normal moral categories. The man who emerged from this period of evolution and adjustment was fundamentally different from the arrogant student who had entered those underground tunnels. Someone who had learned that victory could be more isolating than defeat, while understanding that true success required finding ways to use individual achievement in service of collective welfare and human connection. The strongest sorcerer had been born not just through technical mastery, but through psychological integration of power with wisdom, understanding that his capabilities created opportunities to serve purposes that transcended individual ambition. while requiring sacrifice of personal satisfaction for the welfare of those who would depend on his strength, without ever fully understanding the cost that such dependence imposed on the pes, one who provided it. The legend that would define his place in Jujutsu history was being written not through his techniques but through his choices about how those techniques would be used, decisions that would determine whether his evolution represented triumph of human potential or cautionary tale about the price of transcending the limitations that made connection and meaning possible for ordinary consciousness. The ripples that emanated outward from Toji Fushiguro's death in those underground tunnels spread through Jujutsu society with the inexorable force of seismic waves, transforming not just the immediate circumstances of those who had witnessed his defeat, but reshaping the fundamental assumptions that governed how an entire generation would understand power, responsibility, and the delicate balance between human potential and supernatural capability. The man who had challenged the very foundations of their world through pure determination backed by heavenly restriction had accomplished in death what he could never have achieved through continued existence, creating conditions that would produce changes more profound than any victory he might have won through superior tactics or enhanced preparation. The transformation of Satoru Gojo from talented student into something approaching a living embodiment of absolute power was perhaps the most immediate and visible consequence of Toji's intervention. Evolution that had been catalyzed by direct confrontation with mortality and refined through desperate necessity into capabilities that exceeded every previous understanding of what was possible through cursed technique development and application. The young man who emerged from his resurrection was fundamentally different from the person who had entered those tunnels. Someone whose relationship with strength had been forever altered by experience of vulnerability and the determination to transcend it through methods that pushed beyond every established limitation. The psychological impact of witnessing his friend's apparent death and resurrection created fractures in Suguru Geto's worldview that would remain invisible for months, while gradually widening into the philosophical chasm that would eventually transform him from protector into destroyer, understanding that the cosmic forces governing their existence were more chaotic and unpredictable than institutional training had suggested. While individual capability could transcend apparent limitations through mechanisms that defied rational explanation or systematic replication. The questions that began forming in Geto's mind during the aftermath of their confrontation with Toji were not immediately recognizable as dangerous, but represented the first stages of psychological evolution that would eventually lead him to conclusions that justified genocide as rational response to the fundamental inadequacy of ordinary human consciousness and moral development. Doubts about the value of protecting people who could never appreciate the sacrifices made on their behalf or understand the true scope of the threats that surrounded their comfortable ignorance. The institutional response to Toji's demonstration that non-sorcerers could pose genuine threats to even the most exceptional technique users was characterized by the kind of bureaucratic denial and defensive rationalization that had defined Jujutsu society's approach to uncomfortable truths throughout its long history. Officials who dismissed his success as aberration, rather than acknowledging systematic vulnerabilities that required fundamental reconsideration of security protocols and defensive strategies. The legend of the sorcerer killer that spread through criminal networks and underground markets was embellished with details that exceeded the already remarkable reality of his achievements, stories that transformed him from exceptionally capable assassin into mythical figure whose alleged capabilities were used to justify fear and respect that extended far beyond what his actual accomplishments might have warranted under objective analysis. The young Megumi Fushiguro, who began his education under Gojo's guidance, was shaped by influences that included not just his mentor's direct instruction, but the complex legacy of a father whose choices had created opportunities for growth while establishing patterns of abandonment and sacrifice that would define his understanding of what strength required from those who possessed it. Lessons that were taught through absence rather than presence, but were no less profound for their indirect nature. The educational philosophy that Gojo developed during his early years as instructor was informed by recognition that technical mastery without emotional wisdom was preparation for catastrophe rather than service. Understanding that his own evolution had been achieved at costs that future generations might avoid, through approaches that emphasized human connection alongside supernatural capability, methods that could produce strength without the isolation that had made his own achievements feel hollow despite their objective magnitude. The changes in how Jujutsu society viewed heavenly restriction were gradual but significant. Institutional acknowledgement that individuals who lacked cursed energy might possess capabilities that deserved respect rather than pity or discrimination. Understanding that cosmic balance operated according to principles that were more complex than simple hierarchies based on spiritual gifts and inherited techniques had suggested. The political ramifications of Gojo's evolution into someone whose individual capability exceeded most institutional resources created new dynamics within the power structures that govern decision-making processes. Understanding that someone who could theoretically eliminate any opposing force would necessarily become focal point for every major policy debate while remaining fundamentally outside the collaborative frameworks that had previously determined collective action and strategic direction. The influence that Toji's philosophical critique of Jujutsu society continued to exert through those who had been exposed to his perspective was subtle but persistent. Questions about the relationship between inherited privilege and actual merit that could not be answered satisfactorily through appeals to tradition or institutional authority. Doubts that would eventually find expression through individuals who chose different approaches to addressing the systemic problems he had identified. The underground networks that had supported his activities during his career as assassin were transformed by his death from criminal enterprises into something approaching philosophical movements. People who viewed his success against impossible odds as validation of their own opposition to hierarchical systems that determined worth through accidents of birth, rather than conscious choices about character and behavior. The security measures that were implemented throughout Jujutsu society in response to his demonstration of vulnerability were comprehensive but ultimately inadequate. Defensive strategies that addressed the specific methods he had employed, while failing to account for the broader category of threats represented by individuals who operated outside established frameworks for threat assessment and tactical response, protection that was designed to prevent repetition of his particular approach rather than adaptation of his underlying principles. The psychological counseling resources that were made available to students and staff who had been traumatized by exposure to violence that exceeded their previous experience or theoretical understanding were well-intentioned, but insufficient to address the deeper questions about meaning and purpose that such encounters inevitably raised. Support systems that could treat symptoms of distress while remaining inadequate to help individuals process fundamental challenges to their assumptions about how the world functioned. The research initiatives that were launched to better understand heavenly restriction and its implications for human potential were motivated by recognition that institutional knowledge about these phenomena was inadequate for making informed decisions about policy and resource allocation, studies that would eventually reveal complexities that had been overlooked or dismissed through centuries of prejudice and incomplete observation. The training modifications that were incorporated into standard curriculum were designed to prepare future sorcerers for encounters with opponents who might not conform to conventional expectations about how supernatural combat should be conducted. Instruction that emphasized adaptability and creative problem solving rather than rigid adherence to established techniques and tactical doctrines that might prove inadequate when facing unconventional threats. The memorial services that were held for those who had been killed during the Hidden Inventory arc were conducted with full honors that acknowledged their sacrifice while carefully avoiding detailed analysis of the circumstances that had made their deaths possible. Ceremonies that provided closure for survivors while perpetuating institutional patterns of avoiding uncomfortable questions about systemic failures and preventable tragedies. The classified reports that documented the full scope of Toji's capabilities and methods were restricted to senior leadership, whose security clearances allowed access to information that might prove dangerous if it became widely available. Understanding that detailed knowledge about how to challenge Jujutsu Society's defenses could inspire imitators whose motivations might be less philosophical and more purely destructive than his had been. The international implications of his demonstration that individual humans could pose significant threats to established supernatural power structures were monitored by organizations whose responsibilities extended beyond Japanese borders. Intelligence gathering that reflected recognition that techniques and approaches he had pioneered might be adapted by hostile forces in other regions who possessed different objectives and fewer moral constraints. The academic studies that were conducted by theoretical researchers were focused on understanding the cosmic principles that governed heavenly restriction and its relationship to broader questions about spiritual development and human potential. Investigations that would eventually contribute to more sophisticated understanding of how strength and weakness could be transformed into each other through mechanisms that defied simple categorization or prediction. The inspiration that his example provided to other individuals who had been marginalized or rejected by Jujutsu Society was both positive and concerning. Understanding that his success could motivate constructive efforts toward reform and inclusion, while also justifying approaches that might lack his philosophical sophistication and moral restraint. Influence that could produce beneficial changes or dangerous extremism depending on how it was interpreted and applied. The artistic representations that began appearing in various media were characterized by romanticization that transformed him from complex individual with understandable motivations into mythical figure whose alleged characteristics were used to support various political and philosophical positions. Cultural phenomenon that reflected society's need to process traumatic events through narrative frameworks that provided meaning and closure while often distorting historical reality. The economic impacts of security enhancements and institutional reforms were significant enough to require budget adjustments and resource reallocation that affected every aspect of Jujutsu Society's operations. Financial consequences that demonstrated how thoroughly one individual's actions could disrupt systems that had been developed over centuries of accumulated experience and careful planning. The spiritual implications of his demonstration that human will could transcend apparent cosmic limitations were debated by philosophers and theologians whose theoretical frameworks had assumed fixed relationships between different categories of existence. Discussions that would eventually contribute to more nuanced understanding of how determination and sacrifice could achieve results that seemed to violate natural law while actually revealing deeper principles that had been previously unrecognized. The technological innovations that were developed in response to threats represented by individuals who could operate outside conventional detection methods were focused on creating monitoring and defensive systems that did not rely exclusively on cursed energy signatures for threat identification, equipment that could potentially address vulnerabilities that had been exploited while creating new categories of capability that might prove valuable for legitimate defensive purposes. The generational changes that began manifesting among young sorcerers who had grown up hearing stories about his achievements were characterized by greater respect for physical training and tactical innovation, alongside traditional technique développement, educational evolution that reflected understanding that well-rounded preparation was more important than specialization in specific areas that might prove inadequate when facing unexpected challenges. The legacy that would define his lasting impact on Jujutsu society was not the destruction he had caused or the fear his name continued to inspire, but the questions he had forced them to confront about their own assumptions and limitations. Recognition that strength came in forms they had not anticipated, while weakness could be found in places they had considered most secure. Lessons that would shape how future generations approached the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defined their existence. The seeds of change that his life and death had planted would continue growing long after his individual story had concluded. Influences that would eventually produce reforms and innovations that might have seemed impossible before someone had demonstrated that the fundamental categories governing their understanding of power and possibility were not as fixed or reliable as institutional wisdom had suggested throughout centuries of careful tradition and accumulated experience. The summoning that would restore Toji Fushiguro to a world that had moved beyond his original era of influence was not accomplished through the nostalgic sentimentality of those who missed his presence, but through calculated malice of individuals whose hatred for Jujutsu society exceeded even his own philosophical objections to their hierarchical structures and systematic oppression of those who possessed different forms of strength or operated according to alternative moral frameworks that challenged institutional authority and traditional assumptions about merit and worth. Ogami, the curse user who orchestrated his resurrection, was ancient by any standard that measured human longevity, someone whose accumulated years of bitterness and resentment had crystallized into pure desire for destruction that made Toji's principled opposition to clan politics seem almost quaint by comparison. Understanding that her motivations were not based on hope for reform or systematic improvement, but simple desire to witness the collapse of everything that had excluded her from recognition and respect throughout decades of marginalization and contempt. The seance technique that she employed to breach the barriers between life and death was not conventional necromancy, but sophisticated manipulation of spiritual principles that allowed temporary restoration of consciousness and capability from individuals whose souls retained sufficient coherence to function effectively despite their separation from original physical forms. Understanding that death was not absolute termination, but transition to different state that could be reversed under specific circumstances through adequate knowledge and power. The grandson who served as vessel for Toji's spirit was a young man whose own capabilities were insufficient to contain or control the consciousness that was being channeled through his physical form. Understanding that his personality and individual will would be overwhelmed by the return of someone whose spiritual presence had been shaped by years of violence and systematic opposition to every form of supernatural authority that claimed legitimacy through inherited gifts rather than demonstrated competence. The moment of successful summoning was marked by immediate transformation that went beyond simple possession into complete displacement of the original occupant. Toji's soul, taking control of biological systems that had been temporarily prepared to house consciousness that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those that had originally shaped the body's development and neural patterns integration that was both seamless and violent in its efficiency. The awakening that followed was not gradual return to awareness, but explosive restoration of memory and capability that included not just his technical knowledge and combat instincts, but the accumulated rage and philosophical conviction that had driven his original campaign against Jujutsu. Society, emotions that had been preserved through death, and were now amplified by understanding that his previous sacrifice had been insufficient to produce the changes he had hoped to inspire through demonstration of their vulnerability. The first opponents who encountered this resurrected version of the sorcerer killer discovered that death had not diminished his capabilities, but had instead refined them through removal of the physical limitations and psychological constraints that had characterized his original existence. Someone who now operated with the tactical intelligence and combat mastery he had always possessed, while being freed from concerns about personal survival or long-term consequences that might have moderated his approach to elimination of threats. The curse users, who had believed they could control him through the mechanics of their summoning technique, were eliminated with casual efficiency that demonstrated both his contempt for their presumptions and his complete indifference to the obligations they assumed their ritual had created, understanding that his return was not servitude to their agenda, but opportunity to continue the work that his original death had interrupted, rather than completed according to his satisfaction. The abandoned building that served as their base of operations was transformed into abattoir through application of techniques that had been perfected during his original career, but were now deployed without the restraint or tactical consideration that had previously limited their scope. Violence that was not strategic elimination of specific targets, but artistic expression of accumulated fury directed at anyone who possessed cursed energy or claimed authority through supernatural gifts. The special grade curses that had been attracted to Shibuya by the chaos and concentrated malevolent energy provided him with opponents whose capabilities exceeded those of the human sorcerers he had originally specialized in hunting. Understanding that his techniques and tactical approaches would require adaptation to address threats that operated according to different principles while possessing power that exceeded normal parameters for cursed spirit manifestation and intelligence. The collaboration between these ancient entities was temporary alliance based on mutual recognition that their individual objectives could be served through coordinated assault on Jujutsu Society's defensive structures, understanding that systematic destruction of established authority would create opportunities for each participant to pursue their personal goals without interference from institutional forces that had previously prevented such activities. Through superior organization and resource allocation, the domain expansion that Dagon deployed to trap and eliminate the sorcerers who had been drawn into their confrontation represented exactly the kind of sophisticated supernatural technique that had originally made curse elimination challenging for someone who lacked cursed energy. Environmental manipulation that created battlefield conditions specifically designed to maximize the advantages possessed by entities whose power was derived from spiritual sources rather than physical capability. The water-filled space that surrounded potential victims was more than simple environmental hazard, but manifestation of the curse's essential nature made tangible. Understanding that domains represented the ultimate expression of supernatural technique application, while providing their creators with advantages that approached omnipotence within carefully defined spatial and temporal boundaries that could be maintained through constant expenditure of cursed energy and conscious will. The sorcerers who found themselves trapped within this aquatic nightmare were facing elimination through methods that their training had prepared them to understand, but not necessarily to survive. Understanding that domain-based combat required not just technical competence, but psychological resilience that could function effectively under conditions that challenged every assumption about how reality was supposed to behave, according to normal physical principles. The hole that Megumi created in the domain structure through application of his developing 10 Shadows technique was tactical innovation born from desperation and enhanced by unconscious recognition of spatial relationships that his inherited abilities allowed him to perceive and manipulate, despite his limited experience with such advanced combat situations. Opening that provided opportunity for external intervention that would not have been possible under normal circumstances. The entrance that Toji made through this breach was not dramatic arrival designed for psychological effect, but efficient exploitation of tactical opportunity that had been created through someone else's efforts. Understanding that effective combat required recognition and utilization of advantages regardless of their source, while maintaining focus on primary objectives rather than personal recognition or artistic satisfaction. The weapons that he acquired upon entering the domain were not chosen for their supernatural properties, but for their immediate practical utility in addressing the specific challenges that the current tactical situation presented. Understanding that effective tool selection was based on matching capabilities to requirements, rather than employing the most prestigious or powerful options available without regard to their appropriateness for actual conditions. The playful cloud that he claimed from Maki represented exactly the kind of cursed tool that could maximize his advantages while providing capabilities that complemented rather than competed with his natural gifts. Weapon whose effectiveness was based on user capability rather than inherent supernatural properties. Tool that became extension of his tactical intelligence rather than substitute for personal competence and training. The modifications that he made to this weapon through immediate field adaptation demonstrated understanding that combat effectiveness required constant innovation and adjustment based on changing circumstances. Alterations that transformed general-purpose tool into specialized instrument designed to address the specific vulnerabilities that his enhanced perception could identify in his current opponent's defensive capabilities and behavioral patterns. The systematic dismantling of Dagon that followed was conducted with professional efficiency that reflected decades of experience with eliminating supernatural threats through methods that maximized his advantages while minimizing exposure to counterattacks. Techniques that had been refined through countless encounters with entities whose power exceeded his own in specific areas, while remaining vulnerable to approaches that exploited their dependence on cursed energy and predictable behavioral responses. The coordination between his movements and weapon application was seamless integration of physical capability with tactical knowledge that had been accumulated through years of professional hunting. Understanding that effective combat was not application of maximum force, but precise deployment of adequate power, directed at vulnerable points that could produce catastrophic system failure through minimal energy expenditure and optimal timing. The speed at which he eliminated what should have been formidable opponent demonstrated that his capabilities had not been diminished by death, but had instead been enhanced through removal of the psychological constraints and physical limitations that had characterized his original existence. Someone who now operated according to pure tactical consideration, without distraction from personal concerns or long-term strategic thinking. The satisfaction that he derived from this victory was not emotional response to successful combat, but professional appreciation for techniques that had been executed according to theoretical optimal parameters. Understanding that his effectiveness was validation of approaches that had been developed through systematic study of supernatural entities and their vulnerabilities rather than lucky application of superior physical gifts. The hunt for additional opponents that occupied his attention following this elimination was motivated not by bloodlust or desire for destruction, but by tactical imperative to locate and engage the strongest available targets while his current physical form remained capable of supporting combat operations at maximum efficiency, understanding that temporary resurrection created time constraints that required optimal utilization of available opportunities. The sorcerers who remained conscious and capable after their ordeal within Dagon's domain represented exactly the kind of challenge that had originally motivated his career as assassin specializing in elimination of technique users, individuals whose supernatural gifts provided them with advantages that could only be overcome through superior preparation, combined with tactical approaches that existed outside their experience and theoretical understanding. The battle that developed between him and these survivors was not simple expression of overwhelming capability, but complex tactical engagement that tested both his adaptability and their capacity to respond effectively to threats that operated according to principles they had not encountered during their formal education or previous professional experience. Combat that demonstrated how individual excellence could transcend apparent disadvantages when properly applied. The recognition that gradually developed during this engagement was not conscious acknowledgement of familiar patterns, but instinctive response to stimuli that triggered memories and emotional associations that had been preserved through death, understanding that his relationship with his son was based on connections that transcended normal categories of relationship and identity, while remaining vulnerable to circumstances that could either strengthen or destroy such bonds. The moment when past and present converged through combat between father and son who did not recognize each other represented exactly the kind of tragic irony that defined how cosmic forces operated in their world. Understanding that the strongest connections could be severed by circumstances that prevented recognition, while the deepest loves could be expressed through violence that appeared to contradict their essential nature. The man who had returned from death to continue his war against Jujutsu society was discovering that some battles could not be won through superior technique or tactical advantage, that victory might require sacrifice of the very objectives that had justified the struggle. Understanding that love sometimes demanded choices that appeared to violate its fundamental nature, while actually serving its deepest purposes through actions that transcended normal categories of success and failure. The confrontation that unfolded between father and son in the aftermath of Dagon's destruction was conducted without the recognition that might have transformed violence into reconciliation. Two individuals whose shared bloodline remained hidden beneath layers of circumstance and transformation that prevented either from understanding the cosmic irony of their engagement in combat that should never have occurred between people whose love for each other transcended every other consideration that might have influenced their choices about conflict and cooperation. The Megumi Fushiguro who faced this resurrected hunter was no longer the child who had been abandoned years earlier, but young man whose capabilities had been refined through training and experience that exceeded what most sorcerers achieved during entire careers. Someone whose mastery of the 10 Shadows technique represented synthesis of inherited potential with conscious development that had been guided by mentors who understood both the power and responsibility that came with such extraordinary gifts. The tactical assessment that Toji conducted during their initial exchanges revealed opponent whose technical competence exceeded his expectations, while displaying strategic thinking that suggested education by individuals who possessed sophisticated understanding of combat principles and technique. Application, recognition that whoever had guided this young sorcerer's development had produced someone capable of genuine challenge rather than simple target for elimination through superior experience and physical capability. The 10 Shadows technique that Megumi deployed with increasing sophistication demonstrated mastery that approached the legendary applications that had made this inherited ability one of the most prestigious and feared capabilities in the entire catalogue of cursed techniques. Understanding that his control over darkness and spatial manipulation represented potential that could eventually surpass even the historical figures who had established the technique's reputation for decisive battlefield effectiveness. The divine dogs that materialized from shadow were not simple manifestations, but expressions of spiritual energy refined through conscious will into forms that possessed intelligence and tactical capability independent of their summoner's direct control, entities that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions, while coordinating their attacks according to strategic principles that maximized their effectiveness against opponents who possessed superior individual combat capability. The coordinated assault that these Shikigami launched was executed with precision that reflected their summoner's understanding of how to utilize multiple assets simultaneously while maintaining tactical control over engagement, parameters, deployment that demonstrated both technical mastery and strategic thinking that had been developed through education that emphasized adaptability over rigid adherence to traditional applications of inherited techniques. The speed and efficiency with which Toji eliminated these spiritual constructs revealed capabilities that had not been diminished by death, but had instead been refined through removal of physical limitations and psychological constraints that had previously required him to consider long-term consequences and personal survival when making tactical decisions about resource allocation and risk assessment during combat operations. The weapon mastery that he displayed during these exchanges was not simple application of superior physical capability, but integration of technical knowledge with instinctive understanding of how force could be applied most effectively against targets whose defensive capabilities required precision rather than overwhelming power. Techniques that had been perfected through decades of professional experience with elimination of supernatural threats. The great serpent that emerged from Megumi's expanding tactical repertoire represented escalation in both scale and sophistication of his technique application, manifestation that required significant cursed energy expenditure, while providing capabilities that could potentially overwhelm opponents who relied primarily on physical superiority rather than supernatural defensive measures. Understanding that size and power could compensate for limitations in experience and tactical knowledge, the elimination of this massive Shikigami was accomplished through methods that emphasized efficiency over spectacle. Understanding that effective combat required conservation of energy and optimal utilization of available opportunities, rather than demonstration of superior capability through unnecessarily elaborate or resource-intensive techniques that might compromise future tactical options or create vulnerabilities that skilled opponents could exploit. The rabbit escape technique that Megumi employed as defensive measure demonstrated strategic thinking that prioritized survival and tactical repositioning over direct confrontation. Understanding that temporary withdrawal could provide opportunities for analysis and preparation that might produce advantages unavailable through continued engagement under current circumstances. Decision that reflected wisdom rather than cowardice, despite its appearance of retreat. The pursuit that followed this tactical withdrawal was conducted with methodical precision that reflected Toji's understanding that hasty action could eliminate advantages that patience and careful observation might provide, recognition that effective hunting required balance between maintaining pressure on targets and avoiding overcommitment that might create opportunities for counterattack or environmental complications. The shadows that served as medium for Megumi's movement and technique deployment represented exactly the kind of tactical resource that could neutralize advantages based on superior speed and physical capability Understanding that spatial manipulation allowed repositioning and attack angles that exceeded what conventional movement could achieve, while providing defensive options that could potentially frustrate opponents who relied on predictable engagement patterns. The adaptation that both combatants demonstrated throughout their extended engagement reflected recognition that victory would require innovation rather than simple application of established techniques. Understanding that opponents of comparable capability forced evolution in tactical thinking and technique application that could produce breakthroughs in individual development while testing limits of inherited abilities and learned skills. The elephant Shikigami that Megumi summoned represented commitment of significant resources to offensive action that could potentially overwhelm defenses based on mobility and evasion. Manifestation that possessed mass and power sufficient to cause serious damage if properly deployed, while requiring tactical positioning and timing that made its summoner vulnerable during the preparation and coordination phases of its utilization. The systematic dismantling of this powerful construct demonstrated Toji's understanding of how to exploit the inherent limitations of technique-based combat. Recognition that even the most sophisticated supernatural abilities operated according to principles that could be analyzed and countered through approaches that existed outside normal categories of cursed energy, manipulation, and spiritual technique application. The increasing sophistication of the tactical exchanges between them reflected mutual recognition that they were facing opponents worthy of their full attention and capability. Understanding that half measures or routine applications of standard techniques would prove inadequate against someone who possessed both exceptional ability and sufficient intelligence to adapt their approach based on observation of their opponent's methods and capabilities. The moment when familiarity began penetrating through the fog of combat focus and resurrected consciousness was not dramatic revelation, but gradual recognition of patterns that triggered memories and emotional associations that had been preserved through death. Understanding that some connections transcended normal categories of relationship, while remaining vulnerable to circumstances that could prevent conscious acknowledgement of their significance. The fighting style that his opponent displayed contained elements that seemed familiar despite obvious differences in technique, application, and tactical sophistication. Movements and decision-making patterns that suggested genetic inheritance or training that had been influenced by someone whose approach to combat bore similarities to his own methods and philosophical framework. Recognition that grew stronger despite his attempts to maintain focus on immediate tactical requirements. The name that he requested during a momentary lull in their engagement was asked with casual curiosity that masked growing suspicion about connections that might exist beneath surface appearances. Understanding that direct questions could provide information that combat observation alone might not reveal clearly enough to resolve uncertainties that were beginning to affect his tactical concentration and emotional stability. The response that identified his opponent as Megumi Fushiguro was delivered without awareness of its devastating impact on someone whose entire existence had been shaped by decisions made for the welfare of a son whose development and happiness had justified sacrifice of everything that made life meaningful and worthwhile. Name that connected past choices with present circumstances in ways that transformed tactical engagement into personal catastrophe. The recognition that flooded through his consciousness was not simple intellectual understanding, but emotional avalanche that encompassed years of accumulated grief, regret, and desperate hope that his sacrifice had served its intended purpose while creating conditions that would allow the child he had abandoned to achieve the potential that his continued presence would have compromised through association with criminal activities and institutional enemies. The pride that accompanied this recognition was complicated by awareness that the young man's exceptional development had occurred without his guidance or participation. Success that validated his decision to prioritize his son's welfare over his own emotional needs, while emphasizing the completeness of his exclusion from achievements that represented everything he had hoped the boy would become. Through proper training and institutional support, the realization that their combat had brought him to the brink of harming someone whose welfare mattered more than his own existence created psychological shock that overwhelmed tactical considerations and survival instincts that had been refined through decades of professional violence. Understanding that some discoveries could instantly transform victory into defeat, regardless of technical advantages or superior capability, the weapon that he turned against himself was wielded with the same precision and efficiency that he had applied to elimination of countless opponents throughout his career. Understanding that self-destruction required no less skill than targeting external threats while serving purposes that transcended personal survival or professional accomplishment. Decision that represented love expressed through ultimate sacrifice. The moment when the blade found its target was accompanied by satisfaction that came not from successful technique execution, but from recognition that he had chosen correctly, despite circumstances that made such choices appear to violate every instinct towards self-preservation. Understanding that fatherhood sometimes required decisions that seemed to contradict its essential nature, while actually serving its deepest purposes. The words that he spoke during his final moments were not elaborate explanations or emotional declarations, but simple acknowledgement of connection that had been hidden by circumstances but never truly severed by time or apparent abandonment. Recognition that love could survive separation and transformation while requiring expression through actions rather than words, when normal communication had been made impossible. The pride that filled his consciousness as awareness began to fade was not based on personal achievements or professional recognition, but on understanding that his son had become someone worthy of the sacrifices that had been made on his behalf. Validation that choices which had appeared to represent abandonment had actually served their intended purpose through creation of opportunities that his continued presence could never have provided. The peace that accompanied his return to death was different from the incomplete resolution that had characterized his original departure from existence. Understanding that his story had achieved proper conclusion through recognition and conscious choice, rather than external force or circumstantial defeat. Completion that transformed his entire existence from tragedy into triumph of love over every obstacle that had seemed to prevent its proper expression. The man who had lived and died as enemy of Jujutsu society found redemption not through institutional recognition or philosophical vindication, but through discovery that his greatest act of rebellion had been decision to prioritize his Daen, child's welfare over his own satisfaction. Understanding that true victory was measured not by destruction of enemies, but by creation of conditions that allowed those who mattered most to flourish according to their own potential and choices. The father who had never been able to express his love through normal means found perfect expression through final sacrifice. Someone whose every choice had been motivated by devotion that circumstances had forced him to demonstrate through absence rather than presence, separation rather than connection, violence rather than nurture. Understanding that love sometimes required exactly such paradoxical expression when conventional approaches had been made impossible by forces beyond individual control. The legacy that he left behind was not the destruction he had caused, or the fear his name had inspired, but the son whose exceptional development represented vindication of every difficult choice that had been made on his behalf, proof that sacrifice could serve constructive purposes when properly motivated and carefully implemented according to principles that prioritized future welfare over present comfort and conventional expressions of affection that might have compromised long-term objectives. And so we reach the end of our journey through the blood-soaked legend of Toji Fushiguro, the man who proved that the human spirit, when driven by pure determination and tempered by suffering, could challenge even the gods themselves. His story reminds us that strength comes not from the gifts we are born with, but from what we choose to do with the hand fate deals us. The sorcerer killer sleeps now, in whatever realm awaits those who live by the sword. His hunts finally ended, his rage finally quieted, but his legacy lives on in every person who refuses to be defined by their limitations, who transforms rejection into revolution, weakness into weapon. In Megumi's growing strength, in Maki's defiant path, in the cracks he left in Jujutsu Society's foundation, Toji Fushiguro's spirit endures. Rest now, eternal hunter. Your war against a world that never wanted you has found its peace. The prey you could never quite catch, acceptance, love, belonging, await you in dreams, deeper than any technique could reach. Sweet dreams, sorcerer killer. Your watch has ended, but the hunting continues in those you inspired to never surrender.